Do you take a daily multivitamin without ever really reading past the words energy and heart health printed on the label? I never did either, not until a pharmacy shelf and an old friend of mine changed that. A study that pulled data from a national health survey of 700 men found something most of us would never think to question. The men taking in the most niacin, largely from supplements, showed a meaningfully higher rate of prostate trouble than the men taking in the least. Not a huge dose from some exotic source, just an ordinary vitamin sitting in bottles most of us keep right next to the coffee maker. You'd think a vitamin marketed for energy and cholesterol would be nothing but good news for a man past 70. But here's what doesn't add up. For a lot of men, it wasn't. I'm 83. For 3 years, every afternoon around 4, I'd feel that low, tight pressure settle in behind my belt line, like someone had wedged a fist under there and forgot to take it out. In the next few minutes, I'll tell you exactly what I found sitting on a pharmacy shelf that turned out to be feeding that pressure the whole time, and it wasn't anything I expected to be the problem. These days I can sit through a full church supper, 2 hours at the table, coffee refilled twice, without excusing myself once. I'm not telling you that to brag. I'm telling you because for 3 years I quietly planned my seat near the hallway, just in case. And I don't have to do that anymore. It started so small I barely noticed it becoming a habit of its own. A dull ache low in my belly after dinner. A feeling, by evening, like my bladder had shrunk to the size of a walnut, sending me up twice, sometimes 3 times a night. I told myself it was just what happens to a man's body once he crosses 75, that the plumbing wears out the way an old truck's does, and you either live with the rattling or you don't drive it much anymore. So I adjusted, the way most men my age quietly do without ever calling it that. I stopped sitting in the middle of the pew at church and started taking the aisle seat, the one closest to the door. I turned down an overnight fishing trip with my grandson because I couldn't picture sharing a small cabin and getting up 4 times before sunrise without him noticing. I told him the dates didn't work. They worked fine. I just didn't want to explain why I needed to step outside every hour. At my regular checkup, I mentioned it the way men my age tend to, sideways, almost apologetic. Still dealing with the usual prostate business, I said, and took the doctor's general nod as permission to keep managing it quietly on my own. 8 minutes doesn't leave much room for a real conversation about what's actually driving a symptom like that. It leaves just enough time to nod, maybe adjust a medication, and move to the next patient. I don't blame him for it. That's just the math of how appointments get scheduled these days. What actually cracked this open for me happened somewhere I never expected. Standing in the vitamin aisle of my local pharmacy, restocking a multivitamin I'd been taking for close to a decade because a friend told me it was good for energy and cholesterol. I ran into an old friend of mine there, a retired urologist named Walter I've known since our sons played Little League together 40 years back. He saw what was in my cart and asked, almost casually, how much of that bottle I actually went through in a month. I told him I doubled up most days, because if a little was good, I figured more couldn't hurt. He didn't scold me. He just asked if I'd ever had my prostate discomfort looked at alongside what I was actually swallowing every day. Not just my prescriptions, but everything. The multivitamin, the extra B complex I kept in the kitchen for afternoon energy, the cholesterol formula my brother-in-law swore by. I hadn't. Nobody had ever asked me to lay it all out on the counter and look at the total. That conversation sent me down a path I wish someone had pointed me to years earlier. Research pulled from a large representative health survey of men found that those with the highest intake of niacin, vitamin B3, the very thing marketed on half those energy and cholesterol bottles, showed a notably higher rate of prostate enlargement and related symptoms than men with lower intake. Not a trace amount. The kind of dose you get from stacking a multivitamin on top of a separate B complex on top of a cholesterol formula, each one adding its own slice of niacin, until the total from supplements alone climbed far past what your body actually needs from food. Walter explained the mechanism to me in plain terms, the way he always did back when he was still seeing patients. Niacin at ordinary dietary levels is harmless, even helpful. Your body uses small amounts for basic cell function every day. But push the dose up chronically, the way stacking multiple supplements tends to do without anyone noticing, and it appears to behave differently. It seems to interact with inflammatory pathways in a way that, over months and years, nudges prostate tissue toward more irritation and more swelling, not less. The very thing I'd been taking because I thought it was protecting my heart may have been quietly working against my comfort down below the whole time. He told me something else that stuck with me. Most men assume that if a supplement is sold over the counter, in a bottle with a reassuring label, dosage simply isn't something to think twice about. Nobody's checking the total niacin you're taking in from 3 different bottles stacked on top of each other. There's no pharmacist standing at your kitchen counter adding it up for you. You're the only one doing that math, and most of us never do it at all. I sat with that for a long while. Years of assuming I was doing myself a favor, stacking bottle on top of bottle because a friend or a magazine article said it couldn't hurt, and the whole time I might have been quietly feeding the very discomfort I was trying to ignore. For years, one number ran my life, the PSA. It would tick up a point and I'd lie awake the whole night, certain it meant the worst, picturing the biopsy, the knife, the end of everything. Then someone finally told me the truth no doctor had. That number doesn't measure cancer, it measures your prostate. And as we age, it climbs mostly because the gland is simply enlarging, benign, swollen, and uncomfortable, not the worst. The number was scaring me half to death over something ordinary. And the prescriptions they push to shrink it? They can flatten your drive completely, soften everything, quietly take the man right out of you. I wasn't willing to trade that away. There's a gentle way to support that gland, keep it comfortable, a healthy size, without surrendering any of that. Keep getting checked every year, of course. At 83, that number doesn't own me anymore. I finally have peace. Let me show you what gave it to me in this video. And if you want the simple support I personally use, there's a free presentation linked in the description below. So here's what I actually did, once Walter laid it out for me plainly. I went home and pulled every supplement bottle out of the cabinet, every last one, and lined them up on the counter like a lineup of suspects. I checked the niacin content on each label and I added it up. They came to nearly 4 times what a man my age actually needs from any source. I dropped the separate B complex entirely. I switched my multivitamin to a formula without added niacin, since I get what little I need from the food on my plate already. Chicken, fish, a baked potato most nights. And the cholesterol formula, the one my brother-in-law swore by, I brought straight to my regular doctor and asked whether it was even doing what I thought it was doing. Turned out there were other options that didn't come loaded with the same dose. That single change, cutting excess niacin down to something my body could actually use instead of just process, became the foundation. But it wasn't the whole picture, and Walter was honest with me about that too. He explained that this kind of overload rarely shows up alone. Research looking at more than 15,000 men across a couple dozen studies found that men carrying the pattern doctors call metabolic syndrome, the extra weight around the middle, the blood sugar running a little high, the blood pressure creeping up, tend to have larger prostates and more pronounced urinary symptoms than men without that pattern. It's not one single villain. It's a general load your body carries, and unnecessary supplements were just one piece of mine that I could actually see and correct once someone showed me where to look. That reframed the whole problem for me. I'd spent years thinking of my prostate discomfort as something separate from the rest of my body, an isolated plumbing issue with its own separate cause. What Walter helped me understand is that it's tied into the same inflammatory and metabolic load that affects your heart, your blood sugar, your joints, everything connected under one roof, and a body that's constantly processing an unnecessary excess of anything, vitamin or otherwise, stays in a low simmer of irritation that shows up wherever it's already vulnerable. For me, that happened to be the prostate. I built a small system around what I'd learned, not just the one change with the niacin. First, I stopped assuming more of a supplement automatically meant more benefit. Now I check every label against what I actually need, and I bring the whole lineup of bottles to my annual checkup so my doctor can see the total picture, not just guess at it. Second, I cut back on the processed and fried food that had crept into my weeknight dinners, because that same inflammatory load Walter described gets a steady supply from a fast food burger just as easily as from a stacked vitamin regimen. Third, I started taking a short walk most evenings after dinner instead of heading straight for the recliner, because moving the body helps it handle blood sugar and general inflammation better than sitting still ever does. None of these 3 on their own would have meant much. Together, held steady for a couple of months, they actually changed how my evenings felt. I won't pretend it was simple sorting through a decade of supplement habits. I'd gotten attached to that little ritual of lining up my pills each morning with my coffee, feeling like I was doing something proactive for my health. Giving up 2 of those 3 bottles felt, at first, like giving up a piece of taking care of myself, which sounds backwards once you understand what was actually happening. My wife found the empty B-complex bottle in the recycling and asked if something was wrong. I told her, for once, exactly what was going on instead of brushing it off, and she went and checked her own cabinet that same afternoon. The walks were easier. They gave me somewhere to put the restlessness I used to just sit with after a big meal. Down past the Whitfields' fence line, around the cul-de-sac, back before the streetlights came on. It stopped feeling like exercise and started feeling like the best 15 minutes of my evening. By the 4th week, the nighttime trips to the bathroom had dropped from 3 to 1. By the 8th week, some nights I slept clean through until my alarm went off. I kept a small notebook by the bed, nothing formal, just a line most nights, mostly so I couldn't talk myself into believing progress that wasn't really there. Reading back through those pages months later is what finally convinced me this wasn't wishful thinking on my part. 2 weekends ago, I drove 4 hours straight to my niece's wedding without pulling off the highway once, something that would have meant 3 stops a year earlier. My son-in-law, who was driving with me, noticed before I mentioned a word about it. I think about a man named Sylvester who wrote in after watching one of my earlier videos. 76 years old, a retired machinist who told me he'd been taking what he called his morning stack for almost 15 years. A multivitamin, a B-complex his late wife had started buying him, and a cholesterol supplement his neighbor recommended at a barbecue. He said he'd never once thought to add up what was actually in those 3 bottles, because each one, taken alone, seemed perfectly reasonable. Sylvester told me the hardest part wasn't the diet changes or the walking. It was sitting down at his kitchen table with all 3 bottles and admitting to himself that he'd been treating supplements like they were harmless just because they weren't prescriptions. Once he saw the numbers stacked up on paper, the way Walter had shown me, he said it was almost embarrassing how obvious it looked in hindsight. He dropped the B-complex first, then swapped his multivitamin for a plainer formula without added niacin, and kept the 3rd bottle only after his own doctor confirmed the dose was reasonable on its own. He also told me about the moment it really landed for him, 6 weeks in, sitting through his granddaughter's piano recital, 45 minutes on a folding chair in a warm auditorium, something he used to dread and quietly plan an exit strategy around. He said he caught himself actually watching her hands on the keys instead of counting how many songs were left on the program. That's the part he wanted me to pass along more than anything technical. That this was never really about a symptom easing on some chart. It was about getting to sit through his granddaughter's recital and actually be there for it, instead of half present and counting exits. If you're taking any supplement regularly, especially anything marketed for energy, cholesterol, or general wellness, please hear this clearly. Don't stop or change a dose on your own, and don't assume more of anything is automatically safer just because it comes from a health food aisle instead of a pharmacy counter. Bring every bottle you take to your next appointment and ask your doctor to look at the total picture with you. And keep up with your regular prostate checks and your yearly physical without exception. Understanding where the load in your body is coming from doesn't replace that care. It just gives you something real and correctable to work on between visits. What I want you to walk away with is this. The pressure and the trips to the bathroom you might be feeling aren't automatically just the toll of getting older, something you're stuck accepting because the calendar says 75. For a real number of men, some of that load is sitting quietly in a cabinet, in bottles they've never thought twice about, stacked higher than their bodies actually need. That's not me telling you to throw out every supplement you own tonight. It's me telling you there's an actual lever here, one sitting in plain sight on your own kitchen counter. Here's what I settled on, a few drops a day. And let me tell you why it works. One compound calms one signal, but a swollen prostate answers when several are calmed at once. The growth signal, the inflammation, the pressure inside it. So what I use concentrates them, working as one, the way the research actually uses them, not a single ingredient pretending to be enough. A gland that stays comfortable and a healthy size, fewer trips, and the quiet of no longer fearing that number. It leaves the man fully intact, none of that flattening the prescriptions can do. It's linked right under this video, go look for yourself. It won't replace your doctor or your yearly check. It supports the biology right alongside them. I'm 83, and that number doesn't own me anymore. I think about the man I was, planning his seat near the exit at every church supper, quietly assuming that discomfort was simply the price of being 83. And I think about the man I am now, who sits through a whole wedding drive without a second thought, not because of some miracle, but because I finally sat down and added up what I'd been carrying in 3 separate bottles for years without ever once checking the total. That's the difference. Not a cure, just finally understanding what my own body was quietly trying to tell me. If you've ever assumed a discomfort like this was simply unavoidable with age, or if you've never thought to add up what's actually in your own supplement cabinet, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one myself. And if this kind of plain, honest explanation is useful to you, go ahead and subscribe. There's more of this coming every week.